So we're here to just take a slightly closer look at being specific with treatment with respect to soft tissues. Now we're still looking at relational motion and things of that nature, but what we want to talk about with the soft tissue itself is how we actually put our hands on it. Now, if my hand is like this, we've talked about hand postures in the past, I have broad contact, right? So everything that I'm touching under here could be considered general, it could be considered broad. But if you can see how you can see it if you watch my wrist, I can be very specific to this point. I don't have to change my hand posture. I can be very specific here, I can be very specific here. I don't have to change the shape that my hand's in, I just change where I'm paying attention to. So not only for assessment, but for my ability to actually get specific on soft tissues, I don't absolutely have to have a very specified point, such as thumb pressure, a finger, or what have you. I could have this as a monitoring point, right, if I was trying to go indirect. So as with everything else, the barrier model counts, relational motion counts, patient activating forces count. So if I'm being specific, often we will believe that it should look like this or like this. However, even if I'm going indirect, right, I can identify where in the tissue I have resistance to motion or resistance to pressure, right? Then what I can do is I can have my patient activating forces. So in this case, compression, distraction doesn't really work, it's just kind of letting off, so you remove pressure. Compression, distraction, this is more of a shearing motion, and I can create torsion, so I can stack all of those up to be very specific to the point on my hand that I am palpating specifically, right? It doesn't have to be like this. Now, it doesn't mean that it can't be like this. It doesn't mean that I can't have thumb pressure or a finger to simply monitor. It means that I have less opportunity to actually interface with that soft tissue with that very small contact. So broad contact for multi-point discrimination, get as much as you can touch, things like that. What we look at here is my ability to kind of really hone in, even with a broad hand, to be specific to the portion of the tissue that I'm interested in, using leverage, using patient activating forces. The thing that seems to be out of reach when you're working on soft tissues in a very broad sense, or very difficult to do, is patient active approaches with the muscle that you're using, right? So if I'm working on the hamstring and I have the patient contract this hamstring, it's probably going to hurt. It doesn't mean that I can't get the patient's bones to move underneath the still muscle, right? So that's where we're talking about relational motion. It doesn't mean that I can't have the patient push his hip down or his opposite hip down. It doesn't mean that I can't have the patient push their shoulder down or do something like that to create the relational motion. So I can hold the soft tissue still, and then I can have the patient move some other portion of their body in order to create that relational motion. As far as the patient active approach is concerned, but to actually contract the muscle that I'm touching, it can be quite tender, so it may not necessarily be the ideal approach. But again, what we're looking at is just when we focus in on soft tissue a little bit more, to be specific doesn't necessarily mean a specific monitoring point. It could mean a very broad hand with pressure applied to the specific portion, or attention applied to the specific portion. And then with this broader hand, I actually have more opportunity to interface with that tissue to create that compression and then relative distraction by letting go. I can create shearing motions and torsioning motions within that soft tissue, still working broadly across fiber direction. All of these things still come into play, just as it does with specific treatment in other situations where we're looking kind of position to correction. So macro identifies micro, recreate that macro motion, identify where in the hamstring is most of interest, where it has the highest tension or the most resistance to pressure, aka it won't yield when I push on it. So macro identifies micro still applies. Positioning to correction, using the barrier concept to go direct or indirect. Direct if there is no pain response, indirect if there is a pain response. All of these things still come into play. The only difference happens to be when working with soft tissue is that we don't necessarily need to have that very specific monitoring point or that very local or focal monitoring point. We can still have a broad hand to be able to do more work on the spot that we want, because that larger contact means we have more control over the tissues. So again, all these concepts that we talked about in the past continue to come into focus no matter what we're doing. The detail being, don't as in many cases, just monitor the simple point with one finger. Try to monitor the specific point with your hand in some way where you can still interact with that tissue broadly to control it better.